classic ones. Again, I come from a scientific background, so I have to do things using the scientific method. I can't do guesswork. I have to look at the actual data, and that's all I can really discuss. But the story is becoming more and more interesting as time goes on. So this little one is called Waiki, and it's located, or she actually, we had her DNA tested, and that's the important thing coming up. So we had her DNA tested. She's about this big, and you'll see that Waiki's head is the size of her torso. So head binding is where you change the shape of a skull, but you can't change the cranial volume. So this clearly indicates that Waiki is not an example of head binding, but there's something genetic about her that is obviously very intriguing. Also, I've had many medical professionals go physically with me to look at Waiki, and they say that the rib cage is upside down and has only 10 sets of ribs, whereas we have 12. So if you're interested in looking at the concept of an alien-human hybrid, I think this is the approach you take. You don't just simply say that's an alien. You have to first look at what isn't it. Like, what characteristics does it have that would not make it be a Homo sapiens sapiens? And with the DNA results, there's mitochondrial DNA, which is the mother's DNA, and then there's nuclear, which is the father's DNA.
Okay, this is Jane from England.
Hello.
And Jane was a nurse and a midwife in England and would like to know her impressions about this little mummy that we're looking at here.
Yes.
Please.
Yeah, so I would say that it looks more newborn. The proportion of the head to the body is also sort of newborn ratio, if you like. The skull is very, very thin. It's almost like eggshell. But if you see the fontanelle where the sutures join of the skull,
right,
that's the size of, in proportion to the skull of a newborn. So when the baby's in utero and mum's in labour, and the midwife examines the mum to see whereabouts the baby is, that's what they're actually feeling for when they're examining, to see which position the baby's in. So the fontanelle is where the four skull bones, the sutures, join together. They don't join until the baby's about 2 years old. So although you said that they think this may be around 2 years old, the skull would suggest otherwise. That looks far more like a newborn skull to me.
Okay, but is the body and head not much bigger than you would imagine for a newborn baby?
It doesn't look human. The eye sockets are way too big.
Oh, okay.
The back of the skull, the occipital bones, they look too wide and elongated at the back, and it would be an extremely big newborn baby. However, it looks like a newborn in the, with the sutures. It does look like it's had teeth. Some babies are born with teeth, although it's very rare. And if they are born with teeth, it tends to be the bottom two, right at the front, if they do have any teeth at all.
Oh, really?
So the fact that it's got like fangs is not. It's certainly not common in humans, but it doesn't look human to me. It doesn't look like a newborn baby.
Not a newborn Homo sapiens sapiens.
No.
How about with the arm bones?
The bones, they're quite. It's difficult to tell, isn't it, because of the age? They look quite brittle. In newborn humans, your bones are very soft and malleable. they look very brittle and quite thick. So again, that wouldn't suggest human. The eye sockets are way too big to be human, and the forehead is too high. Even with when babies are born, depending on how they've been born, some babies' heads look elongated when they're born.
Right.
But the skull isn't elongated. It's just that the sutures have crossed over to help the baby actually deliver. So although they might look a little bit elongated when they're first born, it's not that the skull is that shape. It's just that they've crossed over, and within 24 hours it's a normal shaped round skull that we expect to see. That's not moulding from delivery. That skull is that shape. You can see it's not that the skull bones have crossed over and it's pushed it that way. It's all, the bone itself is long, very long, from the fontanelle, the front fontanelle, to the bridge of the nose. Is almost twice as long as a human baby.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, so in your estimation, we're not looking at a baby Homo sapiens sapiens?
No, definitely not. That's not a baby, but also I wouldn't say it's even a 2-year-old Homo sapien, because the eye sockets, the shape of the head, and then again it's the anomaly of the fontanelle. You wouldn't have that on a 2-year-old.
Right.
Very strange, very interesting.
And in Peru, we find many different shapes of elongated heads, not simply the shape like that of Akhenaten, but this photograph shows you the back room of one of the museums, and here you can see different shapes of elongated skulls. And what's very curious is that basically all of them are found along this line, which says the Kapaknyan, which means the Royal Road. And it's along this line we find almost all of the ancient megalithic structures in Peru. So there's a direct relationship between megalithic structures and elongated skulls. So from this shape and this Kapaknyan line of megaliths and elongated skulls, we go to this more complex description or design. And if we take what's called the Andean cross and superimpose it on the landscape of this part of Peru, we see that all the megalithic structures are along this one line, but then other oddities and anomalies are also located on different angled lines. And one of them points to the coastal area of Paracas. Now, many different cultures in ancient Peru had elongated skulls. The oldest ones are found in the Chinchorro culture that was located in northern Chile. And here we have a depiction, and actually an actual photograph, of an elongated skull of the Chinchorro. This could be as much as 6,000 to 8,000 years old. These people were mummifying their dead before the time of the dynastic Egyptians. And then the skulls get even stranger. This is another Chinchorro skull. Notice the protrusion on the forehead, the rounded nature of the back of the skull. So this could actually be a naturally elongated skull. The cranial volume appears to be at least slightly larger than normal. And then as we proceed up this Kapaknyan, which is also called the Path of Viracocha, we reach this ancient volcano. And located behind the volcano are tombs of people with elongated skulls. Not profoundly elongated, but cranially deformed. And here again, another depiction. The volume of the skull is not larger than normal, but you can see the flattening of the back of the skull and the forehead showing cranial deformation. Then the farther we go, we come to Cerro Potosi, which was an incredible silver mine. The entire mountain was made of silver, more or less. And here again, in the ancient tombs, we find elongated skulls. Now what's curious here is the one on the right is cranial deformation. You see the flattening of the back of the skull and the flattening of the forehead, but the one on the left-hand side was about a 2-year-old baby, and you can see that the volume of the skull is quite a bit larger, at least 50% larger than a normal human head. And then the farther to the northwest we go, we come to the one Karani culture. They existed around 2000 BC. And again, you can see the size of the skull is larger than normal and very complex in design. Next, still following this path, this Kapaknyan, we get to what's called Tiwanaku. And Tiwanaku is an enigmatic site close to Lake Titicaca, and there again we find elongated skulls. So once again, the correlation between megalithic sites, this path, and also elongated skulls. This one as well was larger than normal and likely somewhere in the region of 2,000 to 3,000 years old. Further along, we get to Lake Titicaca and the Island of the Sun. This is what's left of a megalithic site, and here as well we find elongated skulls. Once again, most likely cranial deformation, but in this same area, this 2-year-old skull was found with a cranial volume larger than normal. And so this could be our first candidate of an ancient person born with an elongated skull. Then another megalithic site called Silustani, located at Lake Titicaca. This tower is said to have been made by the Inca civilization, but in fact, the Inca did not have the technology to construct this, so they simply inherited it and adapted it for their own use. And here we find cranial deformation. Nothing too strange, but distinguishing between the nobility and the common people. And as well, at Arequipa in Peru, elongated skulls have been found. And next, now it gets incredibly curious, because we're still along this energetic path, and here, close to Cusco, are the remains of this mummified so-called baby that theoretically died at 2 years old 800 years ago. Its skull is the size of its torso. So there's no way that this is cranial deformation. This is genetics. Again, the skull, the size of the torso. And this depicts that, as you can see. You can also see the neck is longer than normal. And this baby, called Waiki, has one set of ribs fewer than what we have. Now, when we look at the top of the skull, this is called the fontanelle. And the fontanelle normally closes by 2 years of age. But this is where other genetic anomalies come into play with the Waiki skeleton. Look at the skull, look at the face. The eye sockets are larger than normal and they're vertically longer. So that is not the depiction of a normal human baby. As well, it has permanent molars. So a so-called 2-year-old baby has the molars of a 10 or 12-year-old. So what I'm starting to insinuate is this is not Homo sapiens sapiens. In the same cemetery, which was a royal cemetery near Cusco, this 15-year-old was found. And this is a reconstruction on top of an actual human skull. She was of nobility. And again, look at the shape and complexity of the skull. Now we're in the city of Cusco, and these are supposedly from the Inca time period, they have not been radiocarbon or carbon-14 tested, so we don't know what age they are. But the cranial volume is at least slightly larger than normal, and we're going to start to see that some of the sutures present in the skull are missing. So here, for example, a 1 or 2 year old baby, theoretically from the Inca time period, the head is larger than normal in terms of cranial volume. It too was found in a royal cemetery, so this was a baby of nobility. Then when we get to the vast archaeological complex of Ollantaytambo in the Sacred Valley of Peru, nearby a royal cemetery, and here you can easily tell the difference between a very large elongated skull on the right with the forehead protuberance, and then some normal looking skulls on the left, but the one on the left closest to the right in that group is quite a bit larger than the others. And as we visit more and more obscure little museums in the highlands of Peru, again, anomalous skulls show up. Oops, sorry. So here, for example, we have maybe a 1 year old baby. However, the fontanelle on top of the skull is closed. The suture, which is supposed to be going back this way, is missing, and it has this protuberance on its forehead. So again, another skull which is anomalous. And at the ancient site of Wari, which is megalithic in the highlands of Peru, these large basalt slabs were not created by the Wari culture. They were found by the Wari culture and incorporated into their construction. And from this location, other anomalous skulls have been found, especially the one in the middle. You also notice that brain surgery has been done, and that we find commonly as well in association with the elongated skulls. It's a very complex subject, but we'll get into that. And at another nearby museum, more examples of elongated skulls. Whether they're from the Wari civilization, which is the one that preceded the Inca or not, again, no carbon-14 testing, so we can't tell yet. But now we start to move into the focus culture, and that's the ancient Paracas that existed between 3,000 and 2,000 years ago. In a very obscure little museum, these 3 mummies were on display, but are now back in storage. And the reason for that will be quite obvious. Look at this mummified baby, supposedly 5 years old at the time of death. The head is the size of the torso. So this is not an example of cranial deformation. This is genetics. And this is just to focus on the shape of the head. The back, you can see, is rounded, and it's very complex in terms of curvature. So again, I'm stating that this individual was born with an elongated head and genetically was not Homo sapiens sapiens. Then, as we get to the coast of Peru itself, the skull on the left is the most famous elongated skull in the world, and it is from the Paracas culture. Some people have labeled it as being Nephilim, others as Anunnaki, even others as alien-human hybrid, and even others as being alien. But you can't tell that unless you actually do DNA testing, which fortunately we were able to do. So in the Little Paracas Museum in Paracas, Peru, we have a collection of 45 different elongated skulls of the nobility of the ancient Paracas people. Now, Paracas is located 3.5 hours drive south of the capital city of Lima, and it is the largest natural bay on the coast of Peru. And this is evidence, possibly, that these people did not originate on the coast of Peru, but actually migrated there from somewhere else. And these are some of the clues. For example, totora reed, which grows in Lake Titicaca, also grows on the coast of Peru. It's indigenous. And with that reed, you can build not simply a canoe, but you could build an ocean-going ship as much as 150 feet long if you wanted to. It just means that you use more and more reed to build a larger and larger craft. Also, cotton is indigenous to the coast of Peru, so sails could have been made out of cotton. And then you had a major sea-going craft. Because what we find in the archaeological record are spondulus shells. And spondulus shells are only found off the coast of Ecuador to the north of Peru. So it's highly unlikely that the spondulus was traded through people walking paths, but far more likely that the Paracas themselves sailed north to Ecuador using these totora craft, because the prevailing winds 80% of the time are from the south to the north, and then 20% of the time from the north back to the south again. And another clue into this is there is a 500-foot tall geoglyph called the Candelabro located at Paracas Bay. And it looks like it's a navigational marker. It can only be seen from the sky or from the sea. And behind it rises the Southern Cross, which is a major instrument of ancient navigators. And it is the beginning of what is called the Nazca geoglyph and line system. The geoglyphs and lines are not simply located in Nazca, but extend from Paracas 160 miles south to Nazca. And now we're going to get into the actual skulls of Paracas themselves and their physical abnormalities. So this is an example of one of the nobility of the Paracas, and the shape is very complicated, and it is completely mummified, including having genetically red hair. So if you have genetically red hair, it's quite likely that you also have lighter colored skin than normal Native Americans, and you could also have had green or blue eyes. These are not the characteristics of indigenous people of Peru from 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, because theoretically, outside genetics, as in European contribution to the genetic landscape, didn't happen until the arrival of the Spanish in about 1532 AD. And then we have a different design of skull. You see the back of this one is rounded, and so this was another class of nobility. It's quite possible that you had genetic variation in the ancient population here, and contrast those two with this shape. This is near the end of the time of the Paracas people. You see the flattening of the forehead and the flattening of the back of the skull. So this is where normal people, normal Homo sapiens sapiens, started to influence the design of the latter part of the Paracas period. And now the most dramatic example. Contrast this shape with that. So here we have cranial deformation, and here I believe this is a natural elongated head of the ancient Paracas people of Peru. Now we can contrast this design on the right with that of the left. That of the left is normal Homo sapiens sapiens. That on the right is vastly different. And then we start to look in finer detail. Here, the suture structure of Homo sapiens sapiens. You have these two suture lines, the coronal coming across, and then the parietal coming backwards this way. Every Homo sapiens sapiens that we know of has that suture structure. But when we look at the elongated skulls of Paracas, the sagittal suture running this way is simply missing. And medical professionals can't explain why that is. Then as well, on the front of the skull, we have what are called foramen. So in our lower jaw or mandible, we have mental foramen, and then there are others located on our face. That is where blood and nerve flow come out in order to feed nutrients, blood, oxygen, etc., to the front of the face because it's quite far away from the actual circulatory system in your neck. But what's curious about the Paracas ones is they have these foramen in the back of the skull. We don't have that. And so what that's telling us is that there is a relationship between the elongated skull and the path of nerve and blood flow. So that again is a genetic characteristic. Then also this extension down here is for the attachment of muscles. So this is what it looks like in a normal human skull. And in the Paracas, it's quite a bit larger. So that would mean muscle attachment, because of the shape and design of the elongated skull, was more complicated in the ancient Paracas people. Then we look at what's called the foramen magnum. And that is where your spinal column and circulatory system enters the bottom of your skull. As you can see, it's right in the center of balance in your skull. But with the Paracas, it's 2.5 centimeters or 1 inch back. So that is a genetic characteristic. And here we'll do a comparison between a normal skull on the right and two of the Paracas on the left. You'll also notice that the actual foramen magnum is much smaller, much narrower in the Paracas, and this indicates that their necks were longer than normal. And this is just another example of that. Also, blood testing has been done of 14 ancient Paracas. And in the literature, what it states is all native people who were and are full-blooded in Peru had or have solely 100% blood type O. But when studies were done in the 1970s of 14 different individuals based on blood taken from cloth from ancient tombs, 28.6% of the individuals were blood type A, 6.1% blood type B, 12.2% blood type AB, and only 53% blood type O. So that means a complex mixing of genetics on the coast of Peru long before the presence, supposedly, of any Europeans or any outsiders. We've also recently figured out that the end of the Paracas was caused by genocide. Some people moved in from the north and they obliterated or tried to obliterate the royal bloodline of the Paracas people and take over their land. So this, what you're seeing, is a killing field. All of these skulls were elongated, all the result of cranial deformation, so at the latter end of the Paracas period, and all having evidence of blows to the head, and the bones are simply scattered. The royal people of the Paracas would have been buried in a very careful manner. These were simply dumped in a pile and buried in a shallow nature. We also know that the famous astronaut of the Nazca system was created by the Paracas people long before the presence of the Nazca people. And as well, in between Paracas and Nazca, there's an area called Palpa. And there we find more than 1,000 geoglyphs created by the Paracas people. So most people know about the Nazca figures such as the hummingbird and the spider. They were created by the Nazca to the southeast in Nazca proper, but in between we have these smaller but numerous geoglyphs, very complex in design, of the ancient Paracas people. As well, hidden in the deserts of the Nazca area, the largest ceremonial city in the world, created by the Paracas people. It was called Cahuachi, and it was inherited or taken over by the Nazca after the demise of the Paracas. And unfortunately for the Nazca people, they were not very good at agriculture, and that combined with climate change in the area caused them to have to abandon the Nazca area around 600 AD. And we know also that what they did in desperation is that they unearthed the older Paracas noble skulls and used them for divination. They cried back to them, asking for them to bring rain in a desperate attempt to survive. So we have other artifacts such as this made by the Paracas depicting elongated heads. And here we have a classic Paracas elongated skull with the genetic red hair. Hair experts who have studied the hair of the Paracas say it is much more Caucasian in character than it is Native American, and that the color is genetically dark red. Also contrast the baby Paracas, which was 18 to 20 months old on the right, with a 1-year-old normal Homo sapiens sapiens on the left of about 1-year-old. Look at the different shape and the different size of the skulls, the difference in the eye sockets, etc. And even their god, who was called Khan, is depicted as having red hair. And in the ancient cemeteries, many different examples of the genetic red hair can be found to this day, and in some cases, blonde hair. Once again, through time, through oxidation, etc., black hair cannot become red or blonde. So this is another genetic distinction. And now what's important is to get into the actual DNA analysis. So in terms of standard migration, supposedly all of the ancient Peruvians from pre-Columbian times, their ancestry comes from haplogroup B. And the source of that is Southeast Asia, and that is consistent with migrating across the Bering Land Bridge 12,000 plus years ago, and eventually migrating to the coast of Peru. However, when we did our DNA tests, the results became quite intriguing. Here we have, once again, the 18-month-old baby Paracas skull. Its maternal or mitochondrial haplogroup turned out to be U2E1, source of which is the Black Sea and the Caspian. And then the skull on the right-hand side, its haplogroup turns out to be T2, which again goes back to Europe or Eurasia. And then this one, its mitochondrial haplogroup is H1. It's found through Europe, but the source area is the Black Sea and Crimea. So it's highly unlikely of migration of people across land to Siberia, across the Bering Land Bridge, and all the way down the Americas to the coast of Peru. It's more likely maritime emigration 3000 BC or earlier. So again, another DNA test, the one on the left-hand side, H2A. Source, the Black Sea and Crimea. And then a more extensive series of testing. Again, the blood or the haplogroup we're expected to find in terms of mitochondrial is B. But instead, what we got from 17 different skulls, U2E1, U2E, H1, H, J1B1. Then some examples did show up, 4 examples of haplogroup B, as in B4, B4, then H and R, and H, and B5. So the majority show ancestry not from the coast of Peru, not from migration through the Bering Land Bridge, but probable migration from the Black Sea and Caspian Sea areas, because that's where the other largest elongated skulls in the world have been found. The 2 locations in the world, the Black Sea and Caspian, Crimea area, and the coast of Peru. And the haplogroups confirm that. So here are some elongated skulls found in the Crimea, Black Sea area. And there you can see, in the case of the one on the right, there is an extra suture line coming down the forehead. That is consistent with what we also find in different locations in Peru. That is not normal in Homo sapiens sapiens. And very recently, a baby was found about 2 years old in Crimea, shown here, with the skull the size of the torso. And so I've checked out the possible migration patterns, and it is quite possible that one can sail from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean, and then into the Red Sea, and then you're caught by a current that takes you across the Pacific via the equatorial countercurrent. From there, you reach the coast of Ecuador, and if you wait for the wind to change, your vessel will be blown straight down to the largest bay on the coast of Peru at Paracas, which would not have had many people living at it at the time. So if these people were possibly refugees escaping invaders, then the coast of Peru would have been a great place to reestablish themselves. Now this is an example of a drawing done in the 19th century from a baby, actually a fetus, found in Paracas. Notice the head is the size of the torso, the neck is longer than normal, it appears to have teeth at 7 to 9 months old in utero, so that obviously is a genetic anomaly, not Homo sapiens sapiens. And then this is a full skeleton found in the Lake Titicaca area. And you can see that the skull is much larger than normal. We're going to go back to study more in terms of abnormalities in the skeletal structure. But this was a female. I was fortunately with a radiologist from the United States when we found this little museum. And when he looked at this, his immediate reaction was, that is not human. And so it gets more curious because he said that was probably a 12-year-old female of childbearing years. And in the same tomb was found this fetus of 7 to 9 months old. And again, you see the skull is the size of the torso. And he believes, 90% certainty, that this was mother and baby, and that they both died during childbirth. And another newborn baby from Paracas. The skull has a cranial volume at least 50%, if not 100%, larger than normal. Curiously, this is a banker who lives in Spain, and he has an elongated skull. So whether there are people living to this day like that or not, I'm not sure. But other anomalies have been found on the coast of Peru. This is the so-called Maria mummy. that some regard as being alien or an alien-human hybrid, but it's been shown that it's actually a fabrication. The body was likely from the Nazca time period of 1,800 years ago, and then the skull or head from the Paracas period. So the skull was likely attached to the body to make this fabricated specimen. Also a three-fingered hand, which was x-rayed and shown to be a fabrication. This is the underside of that. And this is a x-ray. According to two radiologists that looked at this x-ray, the bone structure is not normal. Some of the bones are backwards, and others appear to be from other individuals. So unfortunately, this appears to be a fabrication. And then we have reconstruction efforts done by Marcia K. Moore, who's an American artist. She, for the first time in 2,000 years, has tried to reconstruct what the Paracas faces looked like. So for example, she was able to take this skull from a 10 to 12-year-old Paracas. She had a resin cast made, and then she rebuilt the muscle and skin structure based on the shape of the skull. She has no prejudice one way or the other as regards what this person looked like. She simply rebuilt through interpretation. So here she is clay modeling. And here you can see on the left-hand side is the resin copy that she started with, and then the different phases of rebuilding it. Prior to that time, she did reconstruction based on a computer program. And this is her first analysis according to the computer program that she was utilizing. And finally, this is her latest interpretation. So what you can see from the evidence is that the idea that the Paracas people of the coast of Peru simply genetically evolved on the coast of Peru is highly suspicious. No academics that I know of want to study this subject. We have seen proof that in terms of their blood types, they were genetically and ethnically very complicated. Their skin tone may have been much lighter than normal native people of Peru. They may have had green eye color or blue eye color. They had genetically red hair. They may have very well migrated from almost halfway around the world. And that is the present state of the study. But the DNA testing continues, and I will get to the bottom of who these ancient people were. And I thank you for watching this presentation.
So he even wrote a letter to the Ministry of Culture claiming that he had these bodies in his possession and that where they had been found near Nazca, and he thought they were probably a national treasury, and he wanted them to be declared as a national treasury so that they'd be protected, not only from the environment, but from being sold off to some collectors. There are wealthy collectors on this planet that might swoop in and buy some of these things for their own collection, and then they wouldn't be available to do research. So that was what theory was trying to do. And I guess no one seemed to be interested. Certainly the archaeologists in Peru had been turned off on the whole project. They had been made to believe that these bodies were fake, that they were assembled from cadaver bones, and they wanted nothing to do with it. And so I think that was a deliberate effort by the Ministry of Culture to taint this whole thing, to discourage people from wanting to spend millions of dollars or whatever to buy any of these things because they were fake. And anyway, it turns out that what happened, that I'm not going to read this exactly the way it's written, but there was a biologist. In fact, I don't really know who he is for sure, but I think he was the biologist that came with Jaime when they came down in April to Peru. But he had seen those on the internet, and he contacted Jaime. He knew he was a good friend with Jaime, and said, it appears as though those might be real. You really should take a look at it. And so what Jaime did was contact Theory, and by either internet or phone, and through discussions, was convinced that yes, there may be something here. And so he then contacted Gaia, and some of you may know who Gaia is, but Gaia agreed that yes, it looks like they might be important, and they agreed to help fund a task force, if you would, of investigators, a lot of them were scientists, to go down and look at these bodies. And so they did.
In 2017, in the mountains of Peru, local peasants discovered unusual mummies in one of the caves near the Nazca Plateau. These creatures had three-fingered limbs, different joint structures, skulls, and internal organs. Dmitry Galetsky, a candidate of medical sciences and associate professor at the Department of Maxillofacial Surgery and Stomatology of the First Pavlov State Medical University of St. Petersburg, conducted research on these mummies and gave an exclusive interview to the Alatra TV channel. He said, "Such mummies are rarely seen. Previously, there had been information in the press about similar findings, but they were handed over to the government and disappeared. However, these mummies received some publicity for the first time. It was interesting to determine the truth and explore the anatomy, which fundamentally differs from what exists in our surrounding world." The Russian scientist was part of a large group of experts from the United States, France, Mexico, and Peru. He personally saw the remains of these mummies, and the first thing that caught his attention upon arriving in Peru was the presence of three-fingered beings in the everyday objects of the local inhabitants. When the mummies were discovered, the expert group considered conducting various examinations such as X-rays, computer tomography, CT, and so on. The scientists then proceeded to study the tomography of these mummies, which were named Maria Wowita and Josefina. In addition to them, a vast number of mummies of small creatures were found, totaling at least 6. Heads and incomprehensible human-like beings were also discovered. In the laboratory of academician A.A. Baranov, the DNA analysis of Maria and Wowita's mummies revealed that they did not belong to Homo sapiens. It was also determined that they were not animals but humanoid beings, suggesting that they could indeed be extraterrestrial. Maria, measuring 167 centimeters in height, was the largest among them. She resembled a human, but her distinguishing features were the three-fingered hands and feet. Most likely, she couldn't spread her fingers apart, but she could grasp something by flexing her hand, meaning that she had prehensile movements without spreading the fingers in different directions, said Galetsky. Interestingly, she had 4 phalanges, unlike us. Another intriguing aspect is that when researchers photographed the fingerprints on her foot, the lines were horizontal instead of radial as in our case. In the area of the heel, humans have a heel bone prominence, but Maria did not. The next mummy, which is the most interesting one, is Josefina. Measuring 60 to 62 cm, she is a representative of the small three-fingered mummies. In representatives of this group, the opening in the skull through which the spinal cord passes is not located at the back, like in our case, but in the middle, and it has a square cross-section. Representatives of the Josephine group also have a unique convergence of their clavicles. In the absence of a sternum, the clavicles converge at an angle in the front section, forming a keel-like structure. Images of such keels have been found on stone structures in Mexico. By the way, in Mexico, at El Toro, very interesting stones with images of extraterrestrials were discovered. It is difficult to determine their purpose, but they are fascinating artifacts, which we will showcase at the end of the video. Members of the Josephine group also have 3 fingers on their hands and feet. They have only 1 bone in the forearm and in the shin as well. In addition to that, they have a very distinctive structure of the chest. Their ribs are circular, and they have a fairly long neck with unique vertebrae. Externally, the mummies differ in their facial features. There are distinct slit-like protrusions on the base of their skulls, which are absent in humans. During the examination of the mummies, eye sockets and facial muscles were discovered. The eye sockets contain the optic nerve channel. There are also intriguing openings above the eye area, and the nasal cavity extends into the cranial cavity, rather than being hollow. The cervical region also significantly differs, with no other species, including animals and humans, having such a structure. The thoracic region is represented by ribs that do not converge at the sternum like ours, but instead have a circular shape. The pelvic region of these beings is also quite peculiar. In Josefina, the pelvic bones are vertically positioned, while in Albert, they have a slight tilt. In the image on the right, we can observe a mummy with pelvic bones inclined at a 45-degree angle. The internal organ structure is also interesting, resembling loops. It is unclear for what purpose these loops exist and what processes they were involved in, whether they are vessels or some additional organs. As we can see from the evidence presented by Dmitry Gillespie, the biomechanics of these creatures are undoubtedly different. While the mummies Maria and Lolita share some genetic similarity to human genetic material, Josefina and other mummies are entirely dissimilar. But the most intriguing part is the story he shared. When we were in Mexico, I became acquainted with a culture that originated from El Toro, the images of flying objects that arrived on Earth, and some biological material that was transmitted on the flying saucers. I was curious, since such artifacts are being found, they should surely be in official and state museums. We went to the Central Museum in Mexico, but there was nothing to be found anywhere. I spoke with priests, and I was interested in their opinion on this matter. They said, "You see, our people are not yet ready for this information. We waited for a response from a Catholic church when we found these mummies, but there was no reaction at all, and that is also very strange. In principle, if there is an acknowledgement that they existed, and that Maria is a biological entity with an altered genetic code that may have been modified not on Earth, then we will have to completely revise the entire history of Earth, including the Bible perhaps. This is a very slippery, dangerous question, and not everyone is ready for it. Maybe that's why they are not in a hurry to showcase these mummies and everything else of that nature." While studying this topic, I would like to share a story related to these mummies. As soon as this information reached the media, specialists emerged who scientifically argued that the mummies were fake. One of them was Stanislav Drobiszewski. After examining the X-ray image of Maria's foot, he noticed that the joint surfaces of the limbs did not align, leading him to conclude that the three-toe feature was fake. He was seconded by Michael David, his colleague from the Western Front, who also believed that the mummies were made from bone fragments. A memorandum was drafted, where the participants of the 9th Annual Congress on Mummy Research, by a majority vote, concluded that the mummies were created in modern times from real ancient remains of adults, children, and animals. They titled this document Deception with Extraterrestrial Mummies. However, Russian scientist Konstantin Kurakov, a professor at the ITMO National Research University in St. Petersburg, who also participated in the examination of these mummies, took tissue samples from the mummy's body and its fingers and organized a comparative analysis in St. Petersburg. The results showed that their chemical composition was identical, contradicting the opponent's claim that the fingers were assembled. This finding preceded the DNA analysis, which we mentioned earlier and which confirms the authenticity of the mummies. Peruvian surgeon Edson Vivanco, who was one of those who personally saw these mummies and participated in their examination, is convinced that the mummies are genuine. In an interview with the British newspaper Daily Express, he stated that neither he nor his colleagues found any evidence of surgical interventions on the mummies. In general, those scientists who worked with the mummies firsthand claim their authenticity, while those who study them through X-ray images reject their authenticity. The majority of scientists, however, remain silent on the matter. Lastly, I want to mention a few small mummies found in the southern part of the Atacama Desert in Peru. For several years, experts have been trying to determine the affiliation of these creatures to any known species. During the initial examination, experts noted that these specimens resemble humans in all major characteristics. However, there are differences. The skin of these creatures has a grayish hue, and the mummies measure 20 centimeters in height with bone density of 5 mol. After the external examination of the fossils, they were sent to a local research center. During the scanning, it was revealed that the skeleton of the small humanoid is nearly identical to that of a human. However, The creature's arms and legs have a more elongated appearance compared to Homo sapiens. The X-ray also showed that the mummy has only 3 ribs on each side and 3 fingers on each limb. Currently, scientists have collected all the necessary materials for DNA testing. They have refrained from making bold statements as the results are unknown.
Maria was then relocated to the Inca Research Institute in Cusco for an in-depth analysis. Maria is a fake mummy made of plaster. Well-known British UFO expert Nigel Watson claimed that Maria was a hoax, and that it was easy to tell that the mummy was sloppily created by simply looking at photos of it. And of course, from the ridiculous appearance, the public had also expected that Maria would be either an ordinary plaster figure or a fake mummy. However, the analysis results said otherwise. According to X-rays, CT scans, MRI analysis, as well as radiocarbon dating results, Maria was actually an ancient mummy, buried around the 5th or 6th centuries BC. The white substance covering the body was revealed to be some sort of diatomaceous earth. Diatomaceous earth is a type of soil that is piled up due to the death of diatoms, a single-celled organism. Aside from being extremely absorbent, diatoms also possess an insecticidal effect, to the point where they are called the non-toxic natural desiccant. Scholars stated that the nature of diatomaceous earth is what allowed Maria to be preserved in such an excellent condition. It is said that, unlike the usual mummies, Maria's organs were not removed, and even some parts of her brain remained dry. Of course, the barren environment of the Nazca Desert helped greatly in preserving Maria as well. It is said that Maria does not have ears, and that she must have had long and sharp fangs. She had fewer vertebrae than humans. The shape of her heel bone, as well as the structure of her skull, were also very different from that of an average person. The most unique part of her would be the hands. Her flat fingertips looked like some sort of pad, with a 90-degree downward angle, and unlike humans, she had horizontal-shaped fingerprints. Dr. Mary Jesse from the University of Colorado stated that how Maria's hands were used may have been different as well. It is presumed that rather than grasping something with her fingers, she would instead use her fingers to wrap around the object before lifting it. This means her hands would have been much stronger than those of humans. Another thing that is unique is the non-existence of genitals. This means Maria's gender could not be identified, but the structure of the pelvis showed a high probability of Maria being a woman. It was revealed that her expected age range is in the early 30s to late 40s. Raimundo Salas, a radiologist with 35 years of experience, examined Maria and claimed that she was a 100% natural mummy. He stated that there were no traces of fabrication, amputation, or alterations on her body. However, despite such an announcement, controversy over Maria's authenticity continued. Maria is a mummy that was maliciously made using human remains. It is both an extremely terrible crime and an insult to archaeology. This was the statement made by Peruvian archaeologists from the Academia Nacional de Ciencias at a conference. They said that even experts from all over the world were deceived by the excellent fabrication. Consequently, scholars who were examining Maria immediately refuted the statement. They stated that according to the experiments performed on Maria, biomechanically there was no room for any sort of distortion, and if Maria was actually fabricated, the one who made her would have been God himself. Then, one day, a scholar named Steve Mera volunteered to re-examine Maria. A famous skeptic, he refused to believe that Maria was an alien. He personally went all the way to Peru to dig up the evidence. Mera re-performed genetic tests 3 times, including various radiology tests. He stated that as a skeptic, he would only deliver the truth, and so the tests were performed from an objective standpoint. The results showed that Maria's genes were 98.5% identical to that of Homo sapiens, but the remaining 1.5% did not match any living thing on Earth. Apes are the animals with the most similar DNA to humans, with a general similarity of 96% to 98%. Even with a 2% error, the differences in aspects such as appearance and intelligence are extremely evident. With this, we can conclude that Maria is not a human, considering that her DNA does not 100% match that of a human. Mera revealed that Maria was a hybrid of a human and another species, or simply put, a mixed species. Even after performing further research, Mera could not solve the secret of the remaining 1.5%. I am not concluding that this is an alien. However, it is possible that this was a new generation of human being that actually existed in the distant past, or perhaps a new generation of human being that briefly appeared in ancient times before disappearing. Maria is still being studied to this day. The Nazca lines from the distant past, and the recently unearthed mysterious mummy, Maria. How are these two related? This has been Strange Night.
So in Cusco, the first meeting was April of 2017, and the team was actually shown certain bodies initially, and one of them, first ones that they showed them were hands. Here I have a picture of the hands, which are unusual. You can see they're tridactyl and very long. And now, if you look at your finger, you can see you've got three bones more or less, and these guys have, and they call them phalanges.
Phalanges.
These hands and also the bodies. No, I shouldn't say that. The bodies don't all have 5 phalanges, but these hands were 5 phalanges and almost 12 inches long. So you can imagine how long your hand would look if it was 12 inches.
Dr. Farrell, what do we know about this metal part here?
Yeah, well, that they didn't know for sure what it was until they had an analysis done on it. But one of the things they did know right off the bat was it was non-magnetic, and it appeared like it might be copper. And indeed, the final analysis on that was that it was a mixture that included copper, and it appeared to be something that could have been done by people in that part of the country or that world that back, let's say, a couple thousand years ago. They would have had the technology to make that, whatever you want to call that thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I think they're still trying to figure out exactly what the purpose is.
Was that sort of an implant inside?
Yeah, it was right, implanted right in the skin.
Okay.
Right on top of the hand.
All
There
right.
was 2 of them, and each one was a little different color. So I think one was a little more reddish, and one was gold colored. So here you can see there's 3 hands there, and the one closest had a chunk taken out of it. And of course, that was done so they have stuff to send off for an analysis. But these have been X-rayed and looked at. I don't know about computer tomography, but they've certainly been looked at through X-ray. And here is an artist. There was a graphic designer, Jose Hernandez, who did a good job of, and you'll see when we look at the other bodies, eventually toward the end of the talk, I will show you what his interpretation of the bodies would be if they were living, and this is a good picture here because it shows how you don't need to have a thumb to grab onto something. When you can wrap your hand with all those fingers, you can wrap right around it with your fingers.
That's a very good point because I thought about that when I saw that.
Yeah.
But yeah, with all the phalanges they got, they can just grip something. They don't need they don't need the opposing thumb.
That's right. And, when I was growing up in school, I don't know what point, maybe high school or biology, that was supposed to be a feature of an intelligent being, one that has an opposing thumb so that they could make things, make tools. And so that kind of shoots that theory.
Absolutely.
They also were presented with some heads. And my first reaction when I saw those was that they were monkey heads. They looked like they might have come off of a monkey. Mm-hmm. But when they inspected them, they noticed that the connection on the bottom was a square hole, which is very unusual because most animals, it's a round hole for the nerves and everything to pass down. So that made them a little bit unusual. I think I might have another picture here. Yeah, that's an X-ray of one of the heads. And you'll see other pictures of the heads of some of these bodies. And it's clear that they don't have any teeth. That's one thing. The other thing that's clear is that the capacity for holding a brain in as a function and compared to the size of the body is pretty large. And like you'll see Maria a little later, and it was estimated that her cranial capacity was 20% greater than a human's.
In the human.
And Maria was about the same size as a human.
But they had the sort of the elongated skull, though.
Yeah, well, you can see that the head, you can see the back of the skull is kind of elongated, hooded, you could say even. And I think we'll see that too. This is looking at kind of inside the capacity of the skull. And where the arrows are pointing is assumed where the nerves would come down through that hole, like it would in most animals.
Yeah.
And then they were finally presented with two bodies. They had been given a previous body, but it looked so fake, and it turned out that it was more like a doll that had been assembled from bones. And so they once they saw the X-ray, they put it on the shelf and forgot about it. They were not interested in it. But these bodies, these two here, they were called Josefina and Alberto. Let me go back. Oops. Yeah, Alberto and Josefina, and so we'll look a little closer at them. But notice their necks, how long they are. Alberto's a little longer than Josefina's, at least at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And when they examined real closer, it looked as though they could actually extend and retract their neck, kind of like a turtle. And if you saw E.T., I think it was E.T.
going to say, it looks like E.T.
Yeah, E.T. could do that. I don't know. Steven Spielberg must have known about this, because I would never have thought to depict an alien with an extendable neck, but he did. And sure enough, they think these
maybe he had a little inside information or something.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, just looking at the bones and the structure of it, it looked like they could be extended. And the skin on these is very unusual. Some of the other images that I've seen, and I think I have one a little later here, but it reminds me when we have Thanksgiving, I'm usually the one that has to prepare the turkey and salt it down, and rubbing the skin. The skin looks a lot like a turkey skin to me, but a lot of people call it reptilian-like skin, but it's not human-looking skin anyway.
No, it's not.
Here's an X-ray now of those two bodies with their heads, because one of the bodies they got later on was without a head. But yes, their heads match kind of the ones that they were given earlier. And again, clearly they have no teeth, and they don't seem to have an ability to chew. And one of the first assumptions was that perhaps they lived on a liquid diet that they could take in through their small mouth.
Now, go back to that a minute. Now, there's something there on Josefina that's down around the neck. That's
It happens to be a plate that's on her chest. We'll see that later.
Okay.
And that's an interesting topic, because that plate is made out of metal, and it was whoever implanted it on her certainly had good surgical technology. And these bodies, by the way, were dated to have died approximately 1,000 years to 1,100 years ago. And did they have technology to do that kind of surgery back then? I don't know.
Certainly not according to our understanding today.
Yeah, that's right. And here we're looking down into the vault, if you will, where the brain would be. And it's in the center, more or less. So here's a picture that points out a lot of the things that you were looking at.
Yeah.
The extendable neck, you can see that. They have this is a picture of Josefina, and it turns out Josefina is female, and she has eggs, and you can see 3 very quickly. But a more detailed analysis shows there's still another 4th egg that's in the fallopian tube, and so basically she has 4 eggs there that she's working on. The metal plate that you talked about, Jim, is in her chest, and you can see on the side. You can see it on the side view too. The other thing that's interesting about these guys is their bone structure. They only have a single bone in their forearms and 4 legs, like we have two bones, in our forearm. They only have 1, and so that makes them unique. The bones are hollow too. That's another thing that sets them apart from most animals that we have. They only had 11 vertebrae, and the thoracic cage is you can see that you look at it from the side view, you say, well, how can they have any internal organs in there? There's no space for it. And
Right.
and
Yeah.
yeah. Well, later on, you'll see that they don't. They're
Well,
very limited what's inside there.
Let me ask you this: the fact that there is eggs inside of that Josefina,
Yeah.
which would mean that she would not give birth, live birth, and that she would not be a mammal.
Right.
She
That's
would
right.
be
Definitely.
a reptile or bird-like or something.
Yeah. Here we see a picture of a frog. I put this one here just to point out how similar those small bodies, and one we're talking about now is the small one. You haven't seen the big one yet, but the small bodies are about 2 feet tall, and they appear to be very frog-like. I mean, from the point of view of the fact that their skin, the fact that they're not mammals, and their bone structure is similar to a frog.
Wow.
However, the DNA that they've done, they've never been able to match any of the DNA of that species to anything in the database. It doesn't match frogs, turtles, people, alligators, sunflowers, wheat, or anything. No match at all to anything that they have.
This seems to be a new species of some sort.
Yeah, definitely not a normal species on planet Earth.
Yeah.
I happen to think they're not from this planet anyway, but we'll get to that later.
Well,
I guess.
yeah, I'll say that's an option, isn't it?
It is, and I think many of the people down there in Peru also think that they're aliens. They're not, from this planet. So I'm not alone there. Now here's a computer tomography image of this has to be Josefina because there's the eggs, right? Mm-hmm. And if you look closely, you can't make out too much as far as what's inside in terms of organs, and other images that have been taken of this do not reveal any evidence of a heart, lungs, or even a digestive system. And so that's perplexing because how do they survive? I guess that would be a question. And let me see. I got to look and see what my next slide here. Oh, well, before I get to that, here's a family of more bodies that were presented. But before I leave this one, I want to say what my take on this. In my research over the years, in reading both stories of people who were abducted and what they experienced, mostly that. And I can't even point to when in my readings, because I've been doing this for at least 3 decades. Someplace along the line, I had heard or read by someone who apparently was with what they call gray. I call these the grays. That they don't eat, that they immerse themselves in a fluid, and they take in their energy, you might call it, or nutrients, transdermally through their skin. And so I think
that's amazing.
I think that's what we're looking at here is a species that does not eat but absorbs through their skin. And that forced me to do some research into frogs because they do resemble frogs to a lot of extent. And I only recently learned that frogs can breathe underwater in the sense that they transpire. They can take in oxygen through their skin and expel carbon dioxide through their skin. So when they're below the ice in the wintertime, maybe buried in mud or something, hibernating, you might say, they can still absorb oxygen through their skin. And I think that's what these guys do, but they also take in nutrients and through their skin. And I heard a story recently by someone that they had been talking to another person who they trusted, who used to work in Area S4, which some people may recognize that's near Area 51.
Right, yeah.
And that person who was almost matter of fact was explaining how they had received a living alien from a crash, apparently, and they had a dilemma because it didn't eat. It could not eat. It had no way to eat. And so they were trying to figure out how to keep it alive. And so they came up with the idea of basically plastering the skin with a high protein like peanut butter or something. I don't know. Maybe that's what it was. And that's how they kept it alive. So,
Wow.
so my bottom line is I believe these guys, they're certainly unique. It hasn't been proven that they're alien, although they don't match anything on our Earth. And that I believe that they do take in everything they need transdermally.
Transdermally.
Yes.
I have heard that before regarding with other people who have experienced episodes and with so-called grays, and they said that they said the same thing about the grays, that they don't eat, they don't drink, everything is transdermally. So
yes,
that was something that over the years that I had been told.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I heard. In fact, in my novels, even though there's science fiction, I try to be as accurate as I can. I mentioned that where one of my characters was accidentally abducted, and he was given a tour, and as they were on the tour, a gray walked by, and so the human who had been abducted questions his abductor, who's a friend. In other words, he would almost answer any questions because he was going to erase the memory when they let the human go. But he was telling the human that no, they don't eat. They submerge themselves in a fluid.
It's kind of a good idea because you don't overeat that way, you know.
Yeah. So I don't know. When you think about these guys, what did they do running around Peru? Did they have access to peanut butter, or what did they do? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, those are things we think about, correct?
Yeah.
I just I'm amazed at this whole study. All these not mummies. These were living creatures at one time. Were living beings.
Yes.
With obviously they were intelligent, sentient beings just by the size of their brains. And
yeah,
I mean,
that's right.
This is amazing stuff.
I use these characters in my fourth novel, where they're actually taking care of a mothership, and they're grown.
Mm-hmm.
Like you would grow chickens. When I say grown, they're raised like chickens, but they're highly intelligent, and they run around and they take care of the ship, the mothership. And in fact, I even have them interconnected mentally to the mainframe of the computer, not by wire, but Wi-Fi, let's say. And so they all basically are locked together.
Yeah, well, Dr. Farrell, could this be the Greys? Could this be?
So. Yeah. In fact,
a species thereof. Yeah,
I think so. I'll show you a picture of the cover of my book, and I'll tell you that story. And they're Greys.
Yeah, we have to keep moving. We're down to.
Wow. Okay.
Just about 20 minutes.
I was afraid I'd get done too fast here. Yeah. So these are what they call the family, but they're the same species, and they assumed that the biology would be the same. And this is the tridactyl Victoria without a head, but same species.
Same species.
And here is what these forensic graphic designer would say that they look like when they're walking around.
That looks pretty much like a gray to me.
Yeah.
Now, let's go back a little bit, and we're going to rethread the story here a little bit, because I hope that the congressional hearings in Peru are successful, and the bodies are protected, and therefore there can be some more serious scientific research. And in a little while, folks, we're going to get into the incredible results that have already been found. I mean, this is the real deal here. But what I want to talk about is the whole issue of aliens or not. And this is what I'm getting at is, here they are mummified in Peru in ritual positions. They have obviously been living in that world, in that community. And so should we really call them aliens, or could they be something more like another intelligent species on Earth that is either escaped from the toils of gravity or died out or something? What are we dealing with here?
Really, I think that's the million-dollar question right there, and fascinating to speculate on. Personally, other than the fact that they are non-human, intelligent beings, that are unknown to us, I don't see much evidence for the fact that for the idea that they come from outer space or from. Well, I shouldn't say there's no evidence, because the DNA, which we'll get into, is very fascinating. But they died. There's certainly one thing we can say is that they're not demons. They're not spirits. They were corporeal beings that lived and got sick and died. And I say they got sick because several of these smaller beings have clear indication of bone disease, the kind of bone disease that any animal can accrue in older age. And
the very small ones in older age, isn't that interesting? Because a lot of the ones that are very small are not babies or children, and they're quite startling when you realize you're dealing, and you can see in their faces this is an older person. This is maybe even like quite old.
We don't know. We don't know what their lifespans are. Maybe they live 30 years. Maybe they live 200 years.
Yeah, but I've seen them face to face that were hardly came up to my knee and were obviously adults.
Well, there you are. That's interesting. Yeah. So there are. So I'm saying that one would think if they were aliens fresh off of a high-tech spaceship, at least the way we conceive of these things, they would not be suffering from osteoporosis or, arthritis or other things that are found actually in the bones of these beings. That seems like a very terrestrial, very mundane kind of condition to have. And one would think that if you could fly casually between planets, you would be able to cure those painful conditions in your astronauts. So that gives one the impression that they're not quite fresh off the UFO. Now, another possibility is that they crash landed here 20 generations ago, or 100 generations ago, or there are other possibilities. But it doesn't seem like they are, you can't imagine them walking around in spacesuits with, and with high technology.
Yeah, if they've got diseases of aging, they're ritually buried in a human community. You have to think that on some level they were part of that community.
Well, that's absolutely right. Why the coincidence of them being buried in the same ritual position than the humans are? I mean, clearly there's a connection there. And another aspect is there is, as I mentioned, a metallic element in here. There are metal. It's hard to put a word on them, but there are metal accoutrements on these beings, on some of them. There's one which they call Josefina, who's remarkable for a number of reasons. This is one of the small beings. Josefina had 3 eggs in her abdomen, so clearly not mammalian. And in fact, one of the extraordinary results from the high-definition tomography was that they detected a proto-egg, an egg that was in formation about 1 millimeter in diameter, which was growing on the uterine wall.
Why does this make me feel so sad? I think to myself, this is a woman. She was there. She was, God knows where she came from or what she was enduring, but she had her body was trying to have babies. That moves me. That's right. Go ahead.
Yes, I agree. And she has on her chest what you might call a breastplate, roughly hourglass shaped metal. Again, if you're going to call it jewelry or device, or we don't know what it is. It could be aesthetic, could be medical. It could have some other function that we can't quite understand at this point. But what is certain is that it's metal, and it's applied to the skin in some way. It's permanently fastened to the skin in some way that's not evident from all the the test they can do. And at one point, it actually, part of this metal piece punctures the skin or goes inside the skin, a small amount, into what would presume would be the heart of this creature. So that gives it a more medical, less aesthetic.
But what in the world are we talking about here? Let's get into this thing in a little bit more detail in just a sec. But let's go back. This is a metal object, and it enters her heart with.
It appears to. It actually, part of it actually goes underneath the skin. The rest of it is either on the outside of the skin or joined in the skin in some way that we don't quite understand, like almost a graft or an implant, if you will. But part of that appears to go under the skin. Somebody suggested maybe it's some kind of a pacemaker, that it can apply an electrical current to the heart of this being. But I'll say one thing, Whitley, that you will really appreciate and that not everybody can. And that is, this case is so overflowing with mystery. I mean, you're one of the few people who looks at the UFO phenomenon and says, well, maybe they're aliens, maybe they're not aliens.
Yeah.
I don't know what I know, and I'm not going to say what I don't know.
Yeah.
And in this case is exactly that kind of a thing. Whenever you start to imagine that you have a scenario that accounts for all the evidence here, something else comes up that baffles you.
Yeah, you can't make the leap of belief with this. You ruin your whole thing if you do. But you just have to. Just to say this, speaking of implants and stuff, I'm absolutely fascinated by this because you're talking to a guy who has an implant in his ear. I've learned to use it. I use it all the time. I was using it when I was writing this morning, just an hour ago. And I use it. It's become part of my life. And I'm the luckiest man in the world to even possess it. But I want to know more about what does the surface, does anyone have any ideas about what these objects may have been? Has there been any metallurgy done on them or anything? Yes, in fact, there has. There's been, and that's actually the results are very specifically shown on the website, both the very technical charts where you see the spikes of iron and gold and whatever, and more readable by someone who understands metallurgy and that kind of analysis. But also, I do understand it. Has there been any isotopic analysis done? You know what? I don't want to speak out of school. I don't know if there has. I don't think any. If there hasn't been anything remarkable found. Yeah, there isn't anything on the website. Yeah. I would imagine that would probably be a different laboratory than one that would just determine the chemical makeup of the metal. It's a big deal to do this analysis. Yeah, it's very expensive. And they're not drowning in money, these researchers. So, but one thing I can say, which again speaks to the question of their integration with human society, the one thing that they could say for sure is that in most of the cases, the metal on these beings, the metal on the back of one of the big hands, the metal on the breastplate of Josefina, and a couple of other little metal parts, they match exactly with the alloys that were produced by humans at that time. So that just adds another question mark into the whole thing. So it's probably metal from Earth, and it's stuff that they got here. From people. What the heck is it doing with a wire in it that leads to her heart? Yeah. No, the whole thing is just, again, just when you think you might have a handle on it, you lose the handle. Right. So that's fascinating to me. And this alloy seems to be gold and silver and iron and I believe nickel. So it's a rather complex alloy. And, alloys are not arbitrary. People just don't throw stuff into a pot. They are made for a certain reason to have certain qualities. Otherwise, they just make it out of gold or silver or whatever. It would be much simpler. But these seem to have
the same property of metal objects that have been found in that area in that time period. And that time period meaning about 1,000 years ago. One thing I didn't mention this time, which I should have, is that all of these beings were carbon dated. That's a relatively easy and cheap, inexpensive test to do, and there are many labs all over the world that will do it without. If you're trying to get DNA information, you have to submit a document saying, where did this DNA come from? And that makes perfect sense, so that people aren't just, violating other people's privacy by sending a piece of hair or something in and find out about it.
We're going to get into the DNA in just a minute, but before we do that, I want your take on the relationship between Peru and the United States.
Well, let me just finish that one thought.
Oh, okay, sure.
So the carbon dating was done at 4 or 5 different labs, and there was absolute correlation between all the labs. All the labs came back with all the same results on every one of the beings. And samples were taken from every part of the being, which is significant. We'll talk about that later. In other words, if they took a piece of a fingernail and they took a piece of, the skull.
The skull. But no, talk about it now, because we want to get past this part.
They tested those. Well, to me, it speaks of the authenticity of these things.
Yes.
Because if, as the detractors say, that these are made out of a hodgepodge of animal bones and human parts scavenged from different grave sites and kind of hobbled together to look like a little being, which is patently impossible, but that's their argument, then you would expect there's no way in the world that all those little bits and pieces would have exactly the same carbon-dated age, right? I mean, if they got one part from a chicken and one part from a dog and one part from a baby, the idea that they all would have died within 25 years of each other is stretching it, wouldn't you say?
And also that they would all be that old, because if you're going to cobble this together, you're surely not going to find chicken bones and dog bones from 1,000 years ago.
Well, that's right, and especially from exactly 1,000 years ago, or exactly 1,025 years ago. That's the margin of error in these carbon dating tests for something of this age is somewhere between 25 and 50 years. So, if they say 1,000, that means maybe it was 950, maybe it was 1,050 years old. But but all the labs agree that all the parts of all these small beings came from that very time period. And the larger being, Maria, dated again from around 1,750 years old. So that's obviously that's a huge discrepancy. It's about 750 years difference between the larger body and these smaller bodies. But all the smaller bodies seem to be from roughly the same time period.
So the hand then is older, and the other smaller beings are like a family.
The smaller beings seem to be from the same society, you might say, and presumably from the same species. They certainly look the same. They have the same characteristics. The larger being, Maria.
Oh, Maria, I see. I made a mistake. Go ahead.
She's almost, the hands is another issue, which I even hesitate to talk about, because the hands, there was some ambiguity in the results. Maria, as I said, the human type being with 3 fingers and 3 toes on each hand and foot, was dated at around 1,800 years ago. And the hands, the disembodied hands, which was the first specimens that Terry received, they have been dated, hold on to your hat, they've been dated between 3,000 years and 7,000 years of age.
Wow.
Yeah, and that is not the margin of error in a carbon dating. So there's something going on. Either they were contaminated, maybe they're 7,000 years old and they were contaminated with something that was 3,000 years old. Who knows? That is another mystery. I can't say that every bow is tied up in this case by any means, but I can say with confidence that the carbon dating of the small creatures and the larger humanoid creature are consistent throughout every lab. The hands, the disembodied hands, which are clearly from another species, they seem to reflect ages between 3,000 and 7,000, even from the same hand. So something is amiss with the dating. It's some kind of contamination or some other. But they seem to be, in any case, much older than the other things. So we're talking about an enormous span of time here.
Were they all found together?
Yes.
They were found together. And yet there's 1,000 years of time or more between some of them.
Possibly 6,000 years of time difference between them. And if you think about, a tomb being used continuously or alternatively, consecutively, I should say, by different cultures over 7,000 years, that would be like us, using an Egyptian tomb to bury our people in. That's how long a span that is. So yeah, another mystery that boggles the mind.
Now, let's get these datings straight. The smaller beings are about 1,000 years old.
Yes.
So that would take them back to like the 11th century.
11th, 12th century, yes.
In the 11th and 12th centuries, there was a great deal of UFO activity recorded in Japan.
Wow.
And for example, on September the 12th, 1271, there was a priest who was about to be beheaded when an object appeared like a full moon in the sky, and they didn't execute him. And there was all kinds of stuff in that era. And if you look in Jacques Vallée's book, Passport to Magonia, which I am reading from now, you find it. So it was a very active period in the world. And that I think needs to be known contextually, that there were other places where there were strange things happening and strange beings being seen.
And the date of the older body, the Maria, corresponds to the same period when it's been determined that those lines, the mysterious lines of Nazca that Jacques Vallée also, I know I wasn't Jacques Vallée so much as Von Daniken spoke about
the Nazca lines have been fairly well dated, but it's hard because there's no way to carbon date
organic
them.
Material.
Yeah,
but those seem to correspond to the time when Maria was living. So that's interesting, and she was found in Nazca. So we're not talking about Japan or someplace far away. This was a correlation right in the neighborhood.
I don't see it's too much of a stretch to think that the Nazca Lions had something to do with these beings at all.
Well, both are huge mysteries, that's for sure.
Now, let's now go to the DNA.
Okay, Whitley, I will preamble this by saying that I am no expert in DNA. I've tried to learn a bit, but there are many aspects of the DNA question. It's not as simple as one might think. We say that it's been widely said that a human being has 98% identical DNA to a chimpanzee. That's pretty well established. Somewhere between 97 and 98% of a DNA's DNA matches with a human's DNA. Because we're two little branches at the very edges of the evolutionary tree. And as you go down those twigs towards the little branch, getting into bigger branches, we all have a common ancestor. Some millions of years ago, all primates divided from the line of mammals, from the mother, from the bigger limb of mammals. They branched off 70 million years ago, which was 5 million years before the dinosaurs presumably died out. So just to give a little context. But we are as you go up the tree, when you get into the outer branches of the tree, which represents the species that now exist today, the branches that are near each other, like us and the chimpanzee, share a lot of DNA. And as you go back down towards the trunk of the tree, the DNA becomes more different. So that's just the way evolution works. And the DNA that creates any life form, all of us have, every creature in the world shares a tremendous amount of DNA because we all come from the same trunk of this evolutionary tree. And all the processes like making sugar into energy, cell reproduction, the fundamental things that make life is a huge part of our DNA. The differences between us and a chimpanzee are so trivial that we are almost the same species. We're very close to being able to reproduce with each other sexually. So with that in mind, what I've always heard is that we share 98% with the chimpanzee. We share more or less 90% with a dog, or 94%, because dogs are very much like us. They have heads, they're mammals, they have all the corresponding limbs, etc. As you get further back, when we have our common ancestor with a snake, for example, many millions of years ago, well, that's when the DNA started to diverge more. So we are very distant from an alligator, for example, or a bird. But how distant? We still share all that fundamental DNA stuff that allows us to live as beings. And this is where I've always heard it said that we share 50% of our DNA with a banana, right?
Yeah.
So because a banana has to grow, it has to divide cells, it has to turn sugars into energy, it has to process all the basic fundamental processes of life. That's in that bottom, if you will, 50% of our DNA. Now, here's where it gets weird. And this is where I want to caution that I hope I'm speaking correctly. This is my understanding as a non-scientist. My understanding is that we, according to the DNA tests, we share 30% of our DNA with the Maria mummy.
In other words, they're radically different from us.
More different than we are to a banana. Now, how do you get a banana that looks almost identical to us?
Wait, let's go back to where are we now, William, with all of this?
Well, one thing I want to mention, which I would have preferred to mention before the DNA, because the DNA, again, is mysterious to me and I make presumptions. But what is really cast in stone that you can't argue with is the tomography. What was shown at the conference before the congressman, which we didn't have access to last time you and I spoke, was these high-resolution scans. We all know CAT scans because most of us have been in them for a medical examination. The technology is astonishing. It makes X-rays look like, chalk drawings on a blackboard. You can, once you have these images, you can basically slice up the body at 60 degrees. You can look at various depths into an organ, 1 centimeter, 2 centimeters, whatever you want, by the millimeter or less. They're just astonishingly revealing form of imagery. And that's what they did. They snuck these, with the permission of somebody at the hospital, they took them to the hospital in Cusco and they had them scanned with the highest resolution CAT scanning. Well, at least, I don't know if it's the highest level available, but it's, professional medical grade CAT scanning. So the images that they have, which you can see on the alienproject.com website, are really stunning. And you can see every little detail of these beings and all the structures within them. So that's, I'll tell you, I think we're going to get to what the detractors are saying. What is the basis of the debunkers debunking, which has a number of elements. But for me, what makes, and for the scientists involved, what makes this so compelling, what makes the authenticity of these things unquestionable, are these images, these medical images. You cannot create something that has muscles and tendons and nerves and blood vessels and organs all connected. If you could make that, you would be God, that's
nobody made these. I mean, that argument is over.
And the first, just to put a cap on this part of the discussion, Whitley, that is listen, the beings exist. Nobody can deny that. There's photographs. Many people have seen them, and they've been analyzed in every which way. They exist as objects. The question is, do they represent authentic, once living beings? That's the only question. The detractors, which is what they call the debunkers, the detractors say, no, the small bodies are made out of bits and pieces. And I think all one has to consider, if one has any common sense at all, is how do you make a skull? How do you create a skull that belongs to no animal known to man or to science? They have the argument that these skulls were crafted out of a dog skull, where they cut off these bones and they added these bones. They plugged up this hole. They added those holes. They took out these teeth. They put in these teeth. And that's just simply not what the tomography shows, what the CAT scan shows. It shows an integrated bone structure, which is a skull. And I think that's really all you have to say. And one thing, argument that I've made, Whitley, and I presented on all the skeptical sites, I said, you guys are spending lots of time and lots of money, lots of effort making videos which are criticizing the credentials of these doctors and saying that they're not from great universities and they have a bad track record, or they made this mistake or that mistake in the past. I said, if you want to prove once and for all to the people that believe in that these beings are authentic, if you want to prove to the world that these are fakes, make one, guys. You're saying
that's what I always say to the people who claim that the crop circles are fakes.
Exactly.
And they say, yes, we make them, but then they won't let you see. And I've been with these people, and I've said to them face to face, show me, let me see. And they would not do it. And I think they're liars.
Or they make some crummy facsimile like Doug and Dave did, where they run around with boards on their feet, and they say, "Here, we made one," and see, that's nothing.
But they do make good crop circles. I'm not. Don't get me wrong. They can make good crop circles, and they're made occasionally for promotional purposes. For right. I think
Coca-Cola, whatever they
NVIDIA and other places have done them. But they're not like the authentic ones. They're not nearly,
in very fundamental ways.
Fundamentally different, yes.
Right. They're fundamentally different because, as far as I understand, the blades of grass or whatever is growing there, when they're made artificially, they are crushed. And when they're made, however the authentic ones are made, I'm sure you will agree, they are bent at the node of the stalk of grass or whatever it is, and they are bent in a way that simply cannot be reproduced by a guy with a board on their feet or any other
means. Exactly. The Milk Hill Formation, for example, is not reproducible, and neither is the one that was near the radio telescope. We can't do that. But anyway, we don't want to talk about that now. Let's get back to where we are and where we are going. Let's go past the debunkers at this point, because the DNA evidence, the tomography, it's overwhelming. These are not human beings. They are probably not originated from this planet at all, because there's a lot of the structural morphology of the bodies is very unfamiliar. Let me put it that way, including.
I will say another thing about that before we move on. I don't want to forget this. One of the most stunning discoveries from the tomography was that the bones of these small creatures are hollow. Not hollow in the sense that they have, what do you call it? In the inside of our bones is, what do you call it?
Marrow.
Marrow. marrow. Not yet. They're hollow in the sense that they have air pockets in them. And the only creatures that have hollow bones are birds and dinosaurs, specifically theropods. They do have some characteristics which are very similar to those of reptiles and birds. For example, eggs, but reptilian-type eggs. And the skin is made of keratin, which is the same as the scales of a lizard or a snake. And they have a bone where we have two clavicles, two collarbones that meet at our sternum. They have one bone, which they call a furcula. And that bone is what you find in birds, chickens and pigeons. It gives the birds that big chested look when you see them. And dinosaurs also had a furcula, but the only animals that have that structure are dinosaurs, not reptiles, dinosaurs and birds, which descended from the dinosaurs. So there's some very intriguing similarities between the morphology of these guys and the dinosaurs' birds. So
but not us.
But not us at all. No,
not us at all. Well, isn't it fascinating to think that maybe there was an intelligent species that survived and maybe is still with us in some at a level of evolution that is beyond where we are because they are so old, but they are fundamentally of Earth. That this is really one of the most fascinating shows I've ever done. That thought that it would have any possibility of being true, and this suggests that it might. Wow.
Well, there's no reason, no logical reason that, the way scientists deny UFOs, well, you couldn't go from there to here, or all those kind of arguments. Those are the same arguments which are used to say that no species of dinosaurs could have evolved to be bipedal, sentient, intelligent beings. They were well on their way.
They were well on their way.
Yeah, the velociraptors, for example, that were famous in Jurassic Park, they were very clever animals. They would hunt in packs, and they had these three. Well, that's the other thing. They had all the 3 fingers and 3 toes, and the morphology of the hands of of the small creatures is very reminiscent of the velociraptor hands. So yes, I think that's a real possibility.
Folks, I mean, let's just kind of get our minds around this here. What he's saying, wow. Go ahead. Well, wait, let me ask you another question. What about their relationship, their DNA's relationship to the DNA of birds? Has anyone looked at that?
Yes. Again, very, very distant. They don't seem to be. I mean, if I have this correct, and I hope I do, and if I don't have it correctly, I apologize. I know the numbers are correct, but what exactly the interpretation is, I'm not exactly sure. If I'm correct that the same metric we use to say that we are 50% related to a banana is the same metric we would use to say we are 20% related to these small beings, well, birds are between bananas and us. You understand? Are way between bananas and us. They're much further closer to us than they are towards bananas. So maybe we say, I'm pulling this out of my hat, but let's just say we're 63% related to birds or 72%. These creatures, again, if I'm understanding what I've learned correctly, they are only 19 or 20% similar to us. So
But how similar are they to birds?
Well, again, if a bird is 70, I'm just guessing, if 70-something% the same as us, and they are 20% the same as us, then they are very distantly related from birds as well.
Well, we'll have to look at that because that may or may not be true. Actually, if a lot of their DNA is like bird DNA, without getting into the complexities of this now, we need to take a real serious look at the relationship to birds.
I know that their DNA does not match closely with any kind of creature that science has.
So that gets us back to an alien origin then.
One would think, again, boggles the mind. Yeah.
It's very interesting. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, we talk a lot about hybrid human alien hybrids. Obviously, that's something we've talked about a lot. Now, imagine these creatures, the aliens or whatever they are, the visitors were coming 70 million years ago, and they find a planet not with humans to hybridize with, but theropods to hybridize with. Maybe we should add the possibility that these are hybrids of dinosaurs and aliens.
In other words, they hybridized with a species that could live on Earth long before we even existed. What a wild idea. Man, I'm telling you, folks, if you're a science fiction writer out there, take notes, because you could write one incredible novel about this, and maybe it would have a basis in truth.
Absolutely. I'm thinking if in Peru, these things, or let's say if they found something like a leprechaun in Ireland, again, the same thing would happen. If Peru could own these creatures as their heritage and become the center of scientific, interest from around the world, it could be very, very good for Peru. And I'm hoping that maybe this is a good note to leave this on. I'm hoping that kind of attitude could be engendered by this thing. Sadly, I was going to mention this before, but after this conference, apparently 5 of the leading television news commentary shows in Peru ridiculed this, as you would expect, right? And called Villanueva an idiot, and the scientists are obviously not serious, otherwise they wouldn't be involved, and the whole business. And that's unfortunate, but I think I'm hoping it can be overcome.
Well, it's going to be hard to overcome it, because if they're not open to it there, then it's going to be hard. But we're here, we're open to it, and maybe in time this story will become much more part of the mainstream reality, that they're here, they've been here a long time. We don't know where they're from or exactly what they are, but we know a